everybody. I'm so glad you're here with us today. I am Rebecca Sofer. I run Modern Loss, which is a global movement and online publication, books and community, all focused on sharing stories and showing examples of resilience throughout the long arc of loss and grief. Today is a topic that, it's to me, it's the reality of loss. We're going to be talking about the long arc of loss, and we talk about that a lot at Modern Loss, and my guest talks about it all the time. Loss is not just the first magical 365-day period of time. I think that a lot of people would like for it to be, because it helps people to kind of put stages into nice, neat little containers. And then you move on to the next stage, which is maybe supposed to be a little easier in the next stage. But anybody who's grappled with not just loss due to death loss, but, any sort of adversity in life knows that there are no set stages where things just like constantly get better, that a lot of times it's, 4 steps forward, 1,000 steps back, or, 1,000 steps forward and maybe 2 steps back. And that's just kind of the name of the game, because we're alive and life is messy and wrenches get thrown into our plans, like 18-month-long global pandemics and counting, and, struggles that we didn't foresee coming. And so my guest today is a real expert in this topic. And I'm really grateful that she's here, because right now, we're approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I think that it's safe to say that we're reading a lot of 9/11 focused pieces, personal essays by people who lost loved ones and friends and colleagues in the attacks all over the country, reports by journalists who covered this story, not just in the early days, but years on. We're seeing news about the end of the war in Afghanistan, which is 20 years old, and on a very personal note, every single one of us who can remember is remembering exactly where we were that morning, that beautiful, at least where I was, morning on September 11th, 2001. And, we're just thinking back to where we were when the entire world changed for us. And in my case, it was in New York City. I'd just been rollerblading in the park, because that's what you did in 2001 all the time. So it's safe to say that this is an emotionally activating time for a lot of us. And it's happening in the throes of what is already an enormous, moment of grief in the world for every one of us. So, safe to say it's not one of our happier eras. And I just kind of, have been thinking about this long arc of it, and how I think all of us know now that grief isn't just like these year-long periods of time that keep getting better and better and better, but it's something that kind of comes with us along the way and shifts and takes different shapes and evolves as time goes by. And so my guest today is Hope Edelman. And she is kind of like the grand dame of this entire topic. And for anybody who speaks French, I'm sorry that I butchered your language. I'm a Spanish-speaking human being. Hope is, probably many of you have heard of her. I still can't believe that I get to know her. She's written 8 nonfiction books, including the New York Times bestselling Motherless Daughters. Her newest book, The After Grief, examines finding your way along the long arc of loss. And it's really long. She really knows her stuff. This is like the longest book I've read since COVID. And I in fact blurbed it. So I guarantee you that this book is amazing. She's also a certified life coach and facilitates motherless daughters retreats and workshops all over the world. I have, like I said, been lucky enough to get to know her through our shared work over the years.
Thank you, Rebecca. What a lovely introduction. You make me sound so much more accomplished than I feel like I am, or impressive.
Well, I'll send you my Venmo. You can send me my PRP later. No, seriously, Hope. I quite, I truly think the world of you and your work. I just want everybody who's watching this to know that you are not crazy. Every therapist that I speak to for work these days says that it's a crazy, and they are using the term, it's a crazy time. So you're in good company along with billions of other people around the world. So rest assured that you're normal in the abnormal feeling of all of this. And I also want to say that, while we're talking, please feel free to comment on Facebook, ask Hope your questions, ask me your questions. We're going to be jumping in and commenting later on. So please feel free to say whatever you have to say on there. We are all ears and eyes. So Hope, first of all, what is the biggest misconception about loss and grief in terms of timeline in Western culture?
I think that it is time limited, or that there is an expiration date to grief. And we've sort of been led in that direction through various mechanisms, including stage theory and modernism, and this idea that things need to be linear and progressive and sequential, which implies an endpoint. Whereas those of us who've experienced major loss in the past know that it's an ongoing process. And like you said, it shape shifts over time, but it's something that's with us always. And I think it's as simple as, because the love that we feel for those people never goes away. And so the missing them never does either. It just shows up in different ways at different times in our lives.
Yeah, I remember, I did this therapy called Emdr, which is a trauma-based therapy, as you know, and anybody who's intrigued by it, I encourage you to look into it. I remember saying to the therapist, it was like a year and 10 months after my mom died. My mother was killed in a car accident when I was 30. And I remember saying to him, oh my God, like, I still miss her. Like, I'm still really messed up. And he said, well, how long did you know her? And I said, well, 30 years. And he's like, so it's been 17 months, and he's like, and by the way, if you were 10 and you knew her for 10 years, like, that's enough time to miss her for your lifetime. Grief is a lifelong process. Does that mean it's a lifelong struggle? Because I think that's where some people kind of get like, we don't want to think about things as going on and on and on, right? Because we want to know we have control. It's not always going to be like that.
Right.
But does that mean that it's going to be awful, like so exposed raw nerve all the time?
No, it is not going to feel like it does in the first few weeks or months or even the first year or two. And that's the whole point of the phrase, the after grief. It's what comes after that acute phase of grief. And it's when happiness and joy and laughter and hope and faith, all come back into our life almost in the same measure as before, and sometimes even more. And over time, we start seeing, and this is where I like to place my emphasis, because I've found it to be true with every loss that I've experienced, including the loss of both of my parents and a divorce and the loss of several close friends, which is that any major catastrophe or cataclysmic event in our lives, any major change, sets into motion a chain of events that wouldn't have otherwise occurred. And eventually some of those events are going to lead to some really good things in our lives. And that doesn't mean we have to look back and say, we're glad that someone we love died. No, not at all. It will always be a tragedy. So no, it doesn't have to always be a source of deep sorrow or struggle. It can lead to some really remarkable things. That's what the field of post-traumatic growth is about too. Some people find enormous meaning and purpose out of trauma or tragedy.
And I also, I want to say that I think a lot of people think that when someone says something like that, you can actually find great meaning in the wake of enormous loss, that you're kind of saying, but look at the silver lining, and some people say, well, their time was completed here. So that, no, there's no such thing as that. And what Hope is saying is not like, here's the silver lining, she's saying this happened. And you can't do anything about it, right? Like, this person died or this loss happened. And of course we would do everything in our power to turn back the clock. But what can we take from it? What can we do with it? We're still alive, right?
Yes. And it's not that post-traumatic growth is something that just happens to us. It's not that meaning is something that's handed to us. It's something that we make. It's something that we create. It is often a very willful decision. it's not that we say, oh, I see this goal in the future and I'm going to work my way there now necessarily, but we're making 100 little choices along the way that can lead to some really good things or some growth later in life. I mean, the story that I often tell is that I have two daughters. They're 19 and 23. I don't know if you've ever met them, Rebecca. They're the light of my life. And they wouldn't exist if my mother hadn't died when I was 17. There was a really clear chain of events that were set into motion that led to the births of both of these particular children. They exist in this world because my mother died when I was 17, which sent me looking for a book about early mother loss that didn't exist, which eventually inspired me to write that book myself, which then led to the development of a nonprofit in New York City in the 1990s that needed office space, that led me to rent office space from two men in an office in Times Square above a XXX theater, because it was the 1990s.
Because that's what was in Times Square.
And that's where the Motherless Daughters nonprofit started. And one of those men and I used to share a cab back late at night. He would drop me in downtown Manhattan and he'd go on to Brooklyn, and I married him and we had two children. Would I have ever met him? Would that genetic combination ever have occurred if my mom hadn't died when I was 17? Now, does that mean that I'm grateful or glad that my mom died, or that, no, of course I still wish it didn't happen, but I don't get a choice between losing my mom and having my daughters. That choice doesn't exist. That's just a mental mind game. Right. So because she died and she couldn't come back, I can acknowledge that some good things came out of it, but this takes time. This is not something that we normally experience or can see right away after a loss. And that's where faith comes in. We just have to have faith in the unseen and the unknown and believe that it will eventually lead to good things later.
And of course, when you're talking about faith, you're not necessarily talking about religion. You're talking about like faith in the human spirit and resilience and, and our ability to deal with hard things.
Absolutely. For some people that will come in the form of religion, and for others, it will come in the form of just a form of spirituality or hope.
Now, there's also something that, and I think this is so germane because, again, like I want to couch all of this within, we're kind of sitting here, we're thinking about 9/11, 20 years ago. It's like this huge it's like we're in like a time machine, like my dad always used to say he knew exactly where he was when he learned Kennedy was shot. And I know exactly where I was when the towers were attacked. And I also remember smelling it. I remember smelling the burned wire. I remember, going to Gourmet Garage and like trying to buy all the groceries because I didn't know how long I was going to be stuck at home. It's like I've spent so long in this mindset over the last few weeks. And it feels like, there's something that I read in your book when I was rereading it. You talk about something called new grief and then old grief and then new old grief, which I was like, that's like something that I would try and coin, of course, so what I'm curious about is, I think we all know what new grief is, right? And I think a lot of us know what old grief is, and what it feels like to kind of have it triggered and whatnot. But what's new old grief? And why can it be so incredibly painful?
Okay, so new grief, like you said, is what we experience right after someone dies or we have a major loss. Mm-hmm. Old grief is the recurrent aspect of that, the way it keeps coming around again, cyclically on holidays, on anniversaries, or triggered by what you've called sneak attacks. But new old grief is when we encounter an old loss in a completely new way that we couldn't have pre-grieved because we couldn't feel it until we got there. And this happens a lot with life transitions. If you lost a mother, a father, a sibling before some of your major life transitions, like graduations or weddings or becoming a parent yourself, if you do, it's likely that that old loss will be triggered in a new way. I mean, I lost my mom at 17. And I became pregnant with my first daughter at 32, had her at 33. And there was no way at 17 that I could have pre-grieved what it would feel like to be a mother without my mother. I couldn't even grieve that when I was pregnant. It wasn't until this child was in my arms and I was back home looking at her thinking how sad it was that my mother didn't get to see her grandchild, how lost and adrift I felt because I didn't have that anchor or that support, because not all mothers would be available as grandmothers, and not all daughters want their mothers there when they become mothers.
No, but it's a very
mom.
singular, right?
Yes.
And when you're in it alone, you can't really, you
Yeah.
don't really think about all that stuff, you know?
And so I believed that my mom would have been the kind of mother who would have flown out for my pregnancy and wanted to take care of her granddaughter and help me in the beginning. And so the absence of that was very painful. So that was what I would call new old grief. It also comes up with what are called age correspondence events. And with my audience, or my clients, it's when they reach the age their mother was when she was diagnosed with the disease, but really when they reached the age she was, and then past the age she was when she died. Also, when their children reach the age they were when their moms died. Those are called age correspondence events. And it creates a kind of a new type of mourning for what was lost, because we are identifying not just with ourselves as daughters who don't have a mom, but also with our mother and all that she lost, and then sometimes with our child and what they didn't get to have. So that's new old grief in a brief summary.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. I certainly couldn't have experienced or couldn't have even begun to intuit what it would feel like to, be a parent without my mom, and my dad died too. So within 4 years of each other, both my parents died. And yeah, there was this moment, and I think it hits us during these moments that are always like the universe just makes it a highly inappropriate moment for it to hit you the hardest. I remember having my newborn at my pediatrician's office, and he had acid reflux. I mean, he was on like these crazy heavy medications, and I hadn't slept for something like 4.5 months. And I remember my pediatrician asking me, well, did you have this, when you were a baby? And I was like, no. And she's like, well, do you want to ask your mom? And also, like, do you think that she can come and help you for a little bit so you could get some sleep? And you can only imagine what my sleep deprived state, New Yorker state responded to her. It was, let's just say that I apologize for the next several visits for my reaction. But, it comes up at these times where it's like, you never knew how hard it was going to be until you're in the moment. And like you said, you're not talking about just someone who's experiencing death loss, but there are a billion different types of losses in this world. You went through the end of a marriage, like you're going to go through different milestones with your kids and yourself that you might have envisioned going through them partnered with the father of your children. And, that's going to be a new old grief experience for you. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, when we talk about, I kind of want to talk about like what to do with this. Like, what do we do with all of this? Like, how do we, when we talk about post-traumatic growth, right, out of all of this, what are we talking about? What does it mean? What are some examples? And like you say, I do want to, kind of underscore that in my experience, this stuff wasn't stuff that I was like checking out, like, okay, it's Tuesday, like did this, like feeling better about that now, like that whole situation. No, it's something that more I kind of noticed. It took years for me to notice that I could have a certain experience without having a certain reaction or do a certain action that I hadn't been able to do before, or maybe be appreciative of something that I couldn't be appreciative of before. So, talk to me a bit and all this about post-traumatic growth.
Okay. Well, a lot of people ask me, how can I get to post-traumatic growth? Like, how can I make it happen? And I've got a whole toolbox, but it's so individual, it depends on the client. It depends on the type of loss. It depends on their worldview. It often requires just sort of either flipping a switch or just becoming aware and open to the possibility that there can be more than one story, more than one meaning that you create out of this loss. And this is a big part of the after grief, also because I teach nonfiction writing, and that's what my training is in. The idea that we create stories to make sense of what happened to us. And we start doing that sometimes even before a death occurs, if we know it's imminent, or soon after. We're trying to piece together all the facts and events and data and emotions into some kind of story that feels emotionally and intellectually complete. And that story can change. And we have to be willing to allow that story to change. And once we are, that's the very first step, I think, toward post-traumatic growth. The idea that along this long arc, our relationship to that same set of facts will change and evolve over time. And a very simple exercise that people can do that I feel starts moving them in the direction of post-traumatic growth and introducing them to the idea that their story can change is to start just making a list on a sheet of paper or in your journal of what you've learned as a result of this loss. What are your unique knowledges and skills that you've developed as a result of this experience? What do you know that might be your gift to the world, or to others, or, to one other person that you could share? What do you know as a result now? And most people can do that. And the majority of people will say, I'm so much more grateful for the little things. Or I really appreciate the time I can spend with family now. Their perspective often shifts as a result of a loss. If you experienced that loss when you were very young, this may be much more of a deliberate and willful process. If you were an adult, you may have felt it happening all along because you're more cognitively and emotionally mature than a child. But it's a good way to start moving yourself in the direction of a new mindset that is a growth-oriented mindset.
So I know that we just have a few minutes left, but I have a couple questions left. First of all, what are some ways in which grief gets folded into our identities as time goes on? I can certainly think of several of my own because I've, had loss in my life. It's going to be my ever companion until my end of days. But in general ways, it's like, let's say our mom dies or a sibling dies when we were a child, or maybe we lose a partner when we're 30. As we move through the years, how does that evolve? How do we keep it with us?
Well, there's a wonderful video that was made by the BBC a couple of years ago. You may have seen it, Rebecca. There's a therapist who draws a diagram on a big piece of paper. I write about this in the Aftergrief, and she makes a circle, and they animate this part of the video, which is great. She makes a circle and she shades it in, and she says, "This is, what grief looks like." A dark ball when we first experience a loss. And most of us think that over time, that ball will shrink. But in fact, what happens is that life expands around it. The ball stays the same size, but our life around it gets bigger. But we have to allow it to. Again, if that dark ball in the center is the focal point of our identity, then it will take up a lot of room. But if we allow other parts of life to expand and grow around it, then it's smaller in comparison, but it's still there. But then it's in relation to or in the context of a lot of other things. So it really sometimes is a choice to say, yes, this is a big part of my identity, but it's not all of who I am. I am these other things as well. And I aspire to be these other things. And how can I get there? And that's how life starts to expand around that core black circle in the middle of everything.
Yeah, I really loved how that woman I'm assuming she's a woman because, look at us. But I really loved how she did that, because I remember thinking whenever I would see these drawings of like grief and then like it gets smaller, and I'm like, I don't necessarily view myself as somebody who's grieving. I don't. I view myself as someone who lives with loss. It's my companion. It colors every single thing that I do. It's always there, but I'm not actively grieving. And that grief, but the loss is there. It doesn't like get minimized. What happened, and I have noticed it just with time. It took so long for me to notice it. Is that yes, that jar, that life just ever expanded, and you're right. Like that's what gives all of it meaning, and that's what makes it,
right.
I would say almost like more dealable as this constant companion, because it's still the same size, but the lives are larger.
And the larger life is where we have choice. We may not have had any choice at all about what happened to our loved one or what happened to us in the aftermath, especially if we were children. But that larger portion, that life, is where we have agency. We do have choice. Maybe we don't always have control, but we can take action, hopefully in ways that we weren't able to when the loss occurred.
Right. And I want to say, for anybody watching this who maybe has had a loss that's incredibly traumatizing, I mean, there are so many awful ways to grief, to have grief caused in this world, murder, COVID-19, like horrible
9/11.
accidents, 9/11, losing a child. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish here. Like, I'm not trying to
Not at
brush
all.
any of the trauma away.
No.
It's just that there are certain things that people can do to resource themselves and work with their trauma to kind of harness their resilience more, because resilience is a muscle. I mean, it's not something that we're born with, like this finite amount, like I actually just wrote in my new book, it's not like, like whether we like cilantro or not, right? It's all, or like whether we have male pattern baldness. It's something that's within each of us. And if we kind of encourage it to grow, then it's a muscle, that gets stronger with time,
Although
regardless.
some of us temperamentally may be more naturally resilient than others, but there
Right.
are lots of ways that those of us who are less naturally
Right.
resilient can build that muscle.
Right. So we just have about a minute left. I, literally could go on and on and on with you about this. But I, want to say that I'm just really glad that we're diving into the subject. There is no possible way that we can go as deep as this topic deserves. It's not all black and white. It's not all like, here, I'm over it now. It's like, it's okay to have it folded in. It's okay for it to be hard. It's okay for it to be searingly painful at times. And at times when you least expect for them to be painful, that's just all part of a process and a normal process. And before I wrap up, it's part of being human. Like, I think that there's this tendency to kind of medicalize the experience of grief, or make it something that's like this treatable malady. Like, grief is a mess. It's a mess for years and years and years. And that doesn't mean that it's abnormal.
No, and grief complicates your life in a myriad of ways, but you're right. Only about 15% of mourners have what is categorized as complicated grief. The rest of us are just feeling a lot of emotion,
a mess,
and need each other to get through it, right?
Yeah.
And need to be companioned in the process.
And that's why I think it's so important to talk about it, right? I mean, it's like the more we brush it under the rug, it's not helping out the next person, and that next person is going to go through it. And so I'm so grateful to you, Hope Edelman, and your work. And, you're just promoting this amazing, research and assurances and, commiserations throughout the world. And so glad that you were here to talk about this with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to 1-800-Flowers for hosting us.
Yes. And just a reminder to everybody that, you can check out all the other episodes. They're up on 1-800-Flowers Facebook page. I've spoken with lots of cool people over the last many months, and feel free to post your comments and questions, and we'll get back to them later. Thanks so much, and take care.